There's a story behind this quote. This, in fact, was the first thing that I said to my publisher when he approached me in 2012 and said, "What's this thing about native advertising? Can you take a look at it and tell me what it's about?" I'm the manager of a 5,000 circulation 5-day daily, tiny little family-owned newspaper. And I looked at him and I said, "I don't know anything about this. What is it?" He said, "Well, it's kind of the merging of editorial and advertising." And that was my response. There's no way in hell I'm writing an ad. So I started doing some research. I was lucky enough to be the recipient this year of an RJI Fellowship, which allowed me to continue to do that. And one of the things I said to myself was, okay, if I'm going to be in control of native advertising for my newspaper, damn it, we're going to do it right. We're going to do it ethically, it's going to be good, and the content is going to be something that I am not going to be embarrassed to put my name on. Sort of like, can I move the cursor? There we go. Sort of like this. I think most of you have seen this, I would guess. This is an enterprise piece that was done by the New York Times quite some time ago. It's an absolutely wonderful piece about how the number of women serving time in federal prisons has increased more than 8-fold, and yet the process for taking care of women in federal prisons is, the template is exactly as the same as it would be for men. It had great statistics, it had video, it had analysis, it had a wonderful anecdotes from women who were involved. This would be an enterprise piece that any one of us would be proud to put on our websites or in our papers. But here's the thing. The whole thing was sponsored by Netflix and was intended to promote their program, Orange is the New Black. I didn't want to do that. Sorry about that. I got to go back to my... Excellent. So the first thing we set out to do is define what native advertising is. I did that. Don't click on the top. Ha. Okay, so the first thing we did was define what native advertising is. I did a lot of research on this. I looked at a lot of places. I've blogged about this. It's on the RJI website if you're interested in looking at it. And one of the most annoying things about it is that people seem to lump a whole bunch of stuff under the term native advertising. No, it is not advertorial. No, it is not branded content. Native advertising is content that is paid for by the advertiser, a little transparency there, that is created by the publisher or its representative, and it runs in the same format, and most importantly to me is of the same high quality as that publisher's regular editorial content. So this is the Faribault Daily News, and by extension APG Media Southern Minnesota's definition of native advertising, and we stick to that. So why native advertising? Well, here's why. Thanks to Share-Through for these statistics, 70% of internet users have indicated they're very interested in looking at content through, or looking at ads through content versus traditional advertisements. They're more than willing to read a story and learn what they need to learn about a product rather than a traditional advertisement. They also spend a lot of time on it. One of the big things that Share-Through found out is, on average, they spend 1.2 minutes on content. They spend a minute on native. So they're right up there. And they're more likely, in fact, to look at native than they are regular content. There's a big caveat to all of this. It's got to be done right. It's got to be something that people want to read, and it has to have the right content. So here's an example that ran in my own newspaper. On this side, we have what was just a typical display ad that ran on the Faribault Daily News homepage, about a 10th anniversary bash for the local Whole Foods market. Nice stuff, probably got a few impressions. I'm sure it did pretty well. The native piece that I did that I thought would be more interesting is over here. This isn't exactly hard-hitting news, but I do believe it's all this is Creative Commons slides, old-time food ads. Set to to Creative Commons music. People loved to look at it. They thought it was absolutely hilarious. Just wait till you get to the one that advocates giving your kids, I think it's cocaine for their toothaches. That's my personal favorite. Anyway, this took me, maybe an hour. It kept people interested. They wanted to know more. They kept clicking through it. They stayed through the whole thing. The last slide, as you see, is information about. The last slide is information about the actual event itself. But nowhere in there is there any mention of the actual event, or please come, or you get a 20% off coupon. Did I do that right? Yes. And what made that interesting? People liked to look at it. They thought about food. They thought about old-time ads. They kind of took a trip down memory lane. They laughed at it. They thought it was interesting. It was very simple content to provide. It took me very little time. There was nothing ethically wrong with me producing that. I didn't benefit from it in any particular way. So the question I began to think about is, why exactly can't reporters write native advertising? It's an ad. It's too bad that it's called native advertising, frankly, because I have to tell you, first of all, when I meet with clients, the first words out of their mouth, about as inappropriate as it can get, is, what does this have to do with Indians? Sadly, that's what we get up in southern Minnesota more often than not. But why can't reporters write it? It's not an ad. It's really sponsored content that's written and controlled by editorial. In the Faribault Daily News newsroom, the content that we create stays with us. It archives with us. It becomes part of our regular news product. It does not go to the client. It hurts our credibility. No, it really doesn't hurt your credibility, but that's only if you adhere to the same principles that you would to create any other kind of content. If you start slipping and sliding, for example, writing a story about someone and allowing them to insert their own quotes into that, all the kinds of things that are ethically a little suspect are the kinds of things you wouldn't do with native advertising either. It's a conflict of interest. Yes, it can be. Should your business reporter be writing native advertising? Probably not. And we've discovered that in a number of ways. There have been companies that have attempted to form, I think GE was one, attempted to form its own subdivision of journalists to write native advertising. As soon as they realized that GE wanted to control all the content, that sort of went by the side of the road. So it can be a conflict of interest, but you have to pay attention to the kind of beats that your reporters have and how you can assign them. Features reporters are an excellent place. I personally, as a managing editor, do it in my newsroom, but in exchange for that, there are certain things that I don't do. For example, I no longer control the daily news budget or how we decide where news goes on our paper or in our website. That I believe would be an inherent conflict. And it's pay for play. Well, not really if there isn't any influence. And here's one of the ways you have to think about that. One of my mentors told me, you have to teach reporters how to say no. So, learning to say no. You go out and you establish guidelines as a reporter. You go out and teach your reporters guidelines as an editor. Why wouldn't you use those exact same guidelines when you're creating native content? I had a client who wanted me to change the lead of a story once because he thought it sounded too messy. Sorry, you can't do that. I had another one ask me if we could change a quote because he thought he sounded stupid. Sorry, you can't do that. In the end, I have never had a client yet pull any of their native advertising as a result of the standards that we have set. And that's because we express them up front. We tell them what they're going to get. We tell them what they are allowed to do in the process. And most of the time, they're really happy with it. And the people who aren't, we just keep going back to them and explaining to them, and eventually we reach an understanding. So empower your journalists. You would want to do this regardless, frankly. They're ethical folks. You don't have to force them to be anything else. And one of the ways I like to use an example of this is sharing stories in advance of publication. That's a big no-no in journalism circles, usually. I'm one of the few people that advocate for maybe rethinking that policy, and the reason why, I have two reasons. One, you know, we want to strive for accuracy. We want to strive for the best possible journalism that we can. We want to strive for delivering information in a way that's usable for our audiences. So if our sources can help us do that, why not share the story with them? The second piece of that that's critical, however, is making sure at the other end of that you have a journalist who's willing to say no. Okay, thanks for taking a look at this story for me. Thanks for pointing out some facts that could be clarified a little better. But no, I'm not going to change the organization of it. No, I'm not going to clean up your quote for you. No, I'm not going to add a sidebar that talks about how great or wonderful you are. Those are the kinds of things that we teach kids in journalism school. There's no reason why we can't continue that lesson. Teach them to engage. That's what the last 2 days have been all about. Perception really isn't everything. One of the things that I hear over and over and over again from people is, people in the community are going to perceive that you've been purchased, you've been bought by these businesses. Actually, that hasn't been the case. We've been doing it for 9 months. We have more than 100 clients. Keep in mind, we're a town of 20,000. I see people in the grocery store who yell at me about their church listing. No one has ever yelled at me for this. In fact, they've been really happy to read the kind of content that we've created, all kinds of interesting and different things. And no one has said boo about that. The fact is, we're very clear, we're very transparent. We're right up front with both the people who are on the receiving end of this content and the people who are creating it. So, some examples for you. This comes from the South Bend Tribune. They did this entire special section. This is actually one of the stories inside that's bylined by one of their reporters in partnership with St. Joseph Regional Medical Center. This is a great piece. It's a special section that inserted at the end of the year, November 2013, on healthcare reform, your guide to creating, working your way through the Affordable Care Act. And it was done all in partnership with the local hospital. They paid for all of it. Here's another example. This is an app that was created by The Guardian. It's called Guardian Witness. This is essentially their citizen journalism efforts. It is powered entirely by EE, which, if I understand correctly, is a utility, I believe, over in England. And essentially what they do is allow citizens to pop on there and put their news of note from various parts of the country on there, and sometimes this content is used in regular reporting by The Guardian. The whole thing is powered by another agency. And this is from Mike.com. Mike is a really interesting site. It says its philosophy is to create news for millennials. It started out in a garage in Harlem. It now has 22 million hits every single month. This is an enterprise piece that talked about the suicide epidemic in Utah and the perspective of a neuroscientist and his theory about why that is the case. I would strongly encourage you to take a look at this. You can just Google it on Mike or Google Mike and take a look at it. This is frankly most of what they do is heavy-duty enterprise and investigative pieces that are aimed at millennials. And every single one of them is sponsored. This one is sponsored by GE, which has absolutely nothing to do with Utah or the suicide epidemic. But they know that journalism is important. They want to continue to fund journalism. They saw the story before it published. They had absolutely no feedback. And this is the little old daily news. This is a piece that I did, I think is just a great typical story that I would do. We got a press release from the State High School Association about the Clay Target League and the importance of the numbers there, how much they had doubled. Generally, I would just take this press release and shovel it off to our sports editor to write, but instead we found a sponsor for it, which is a local gun club, Almonds, right here. We hyperlink to their site off of the story itself. That's the only mention of almonds in the entire story. They are not quoted in there. I took pictures of the kids practicing. I talked to coaches. I essentially just wrote a news story about how Clay Target teams' numbers are doubling in southern Minnesota. Very, very basic stuff. regular news story that someone helped support with their sponsorship. So I guess the lesson I learned from the curmudgeon that started out saying, no way in hell am I going to write an ad, is that if you apply the same principles that you apply to every other type of journalism you do to native advertising, you can do it successfully. You can introduce it into your newsrooms, and you can make it a vital part of your revenue stream in the future. So I have this really cool website on the Reynolds Journalism Institute website. It's The Wonderful World of Native Advertising by Jaci Smith. This is the link to it if you're interested. You can take a look. It's got all my blogs, all my slips and falls and stumbles on the way to enlightenment and native advertising. So feel free to take a look at it. And that's all I got. Thanks.
Questions, thoughts? Okay.
Jackie, just take a moment, though, and talk about the success or what's come of this. You've talked about how you did it, but what's been the result?
Oh, okay, sure. From a purely revenue standpoint, we use the RJI Fellowship money to hire a part-time person to take over some of my duties so that I could spend time creating native advertising. It has succeeded to the point now that starting at the end of this fellowship, which is the end of next month, I'll shift over to doing some of the web work for our company and creative native advertising full-time, and my job will be fully funded that way, and hopefully quite a bit more. As I said earlier, we have more than 100 clients, and we have a 75% close rate, which means if we can get in front of the client 75% of the time, they'll go ahead and advertise with us. They see the value of it. Some of the stats that we've had, we average about 1 minute and 15 seconds for every piece of native advertising that we do. That compares to about 1 minute 30 for our regular editorial content on our site. We just stepped into reverse publishing native advertising, which is a whole other can of worms, producing it in print. But again, we're wading our way through that and making some money that way. So it is viable. It's viable for a 5,000 circulation newspaper, so I'm sure it would be viable for yours.
So in the public media world, we're in some ways closer to this and further away at the same time. So we take grant money from, for example, KBIA, the Missouri Foundation for Health. They pay for roughly 2 of our health reporters, but they have no input in what stories we do or any content that happens from that. That being said, if you listen to our weather, it's brought to you by so-and-so organization. The St. Louis Public Radio building has Monsanto across the side, not literally across the side, but these are things that in some ways we're used to, but the other times it feels very strange then to look at something like what the New York Times did with Netflix and go, that's still in keeping with our value system. Or if you look at sort of the Chevron pieces that the New York Times have done too, those get into really complicated issues because the New York Times does cover sustainable energy. And in the case of the gun club you were referencing, what would happen then in your newsroom if, you know, there's a news story that reflects very negatively on that advertiser because something occurs? How do you handle those conflicts, and how do you prevent the sales department from saying, you know, hey, we want you to do this story about this local music venue, and then your reporter goes, well, there's a ton of labor abuses there, so I'm going to put that in my piece too. How do you handle those conflicts, or how would you recommend that we have those conversations before we get in those conflicts?
Yes. Well, the first thing I would recommend is that you need a journalist doing your native advertising, not an ad person. Because a journalist, and no offense to any of the ad people in the room, sorry, I get into this trouble every time. Because a journalist sort of has been raised to understand that the conflict that's inherent in those, I can apply the scenario that you had about the gun club. We have written negative stories. I wrote an editorial very anti-gun probably 3 or 4 months before this ran, and got a phone call from the owner saying, you know, what the heck are you doing? Why, how dare you? I mean, my whole livelihood is based on guns. And, you know, I explained to him that this was the position of the editorial board. The editorial board is, you know, separate from this, separate from that. For me, it's about transparency. I write a ton of columns in my newspaper explaining what I do, how it all works, how it all comes together. I spend a ton of time talking to my reporters. And generally, I don't know that this is the case everywhere, but generally, there's good communication between the advertising and the editorial department in my building. So if they were to come to me and say, I want you to write about this music festival, but you can't write anything negative, they'd be told politely that, no, that's not going to be the case. Taking that one step further, however, if that person was a native advertiser, I would go to them and say, you understand there is this piece of it, so how are we going to handle that? And there would be a conversation that would happen. I'm a firm believer in communication, and that's how these kinds of things get resolved. Maybe a little idealistic, but it's worked so far.
So just quickly, you mentioned showing a story to a sponsor ahead of time, but you also mentioned that they weren't going to be able to change a lead or a quote. So why show it to them? I'm not sure that, I don't understand.
Interesting, very good question. I showed it to them because that was my compromise. It started with as a compromise to the ad department, because on the ad side, the process is they get the information, they create an ad, the ad proof is sent out to the advertiser looks at it, checks off, and then it runs. And so in order to sort of conform to that process, I was told, this is what you have to do. Now, in some departments or some native advertising programs, they don't necessarily do that. They actually don't. They adhere to the strict journalism rule, not sharing the story. I did it because, again, I had a conversation with a former publisher of mine, and he said, you know, if you're an ethical publisher, you're an ethical journalist, what's the problem with sharing it with them, as long as they understand what the rules of the road are? And the point in sharing it is, you know, for one case, I did a story on a senior center and used probably insensitive language, I would say, when I was talking about some seniors, and they said, you know, it'd be better, the better language to use that would be less insensitive towards seniors would be to phrase it like this. And so that I felt grateful for that. Certainly, I don't ever want to be insensitive. So, you know, that kind of editing I'll take from anybody.
Jackie, thank you very much. Appreciate it.